Marry the fat one, Papa. The fat bride was mocked until Mountain Man's daughter called her mom. Marry the fat one, Papa. The childish taunt rang through the crowded town social like a cruel bell. Laughter burst out from every corner of the hall, harsh and merciless, aimed straight at Naomi Dawson. She stood in her handmade dress, face burning, clutching a plate of biscuits she'd baked, her heart splintering as men and women, neighbors she had served and sewn for, pointed and snickered at her size. Naomi had long grown used to whispers, but this was different. The words had come from the lips of a child, innocent in age, vicious in echo. Every chuckle, every mocking glance felt like a nail driven into her dignity. Her hands trembled, the biscuits tumbled to the floor, and still the laughter swelled. Then silence. The tall frame of Sam Holt filled the doorway, a mountain man, broad-shouldered, scarred by weather and grief, known more for his solitude than his presence in town. At his side clutched a little girl, no more than 7, Annie Holt. Since her mother's passing, no one had seen her smile, but now, before the whole room, the girl broke free, running across the floorboards with a cry that cracked like thunder. She threw her arms around Naomi's waist and pressed her face to her. "Mama," she whispered, loud enough for all to hear. Gasps replaced laughter. Men shifted uneasily. Women looked away, shame creeping over their faces. Naomi froze, stunned by the warmth of those small arms around her. Sam stepped forward, his voice low, unyielding. "If my daughter calls her mother, then she is, and I'll make it so tonight." The hall erupted in disbelief. A shotgun wedding? With her? Yet Naomi, staring into Annie's tear-filled eyes, felt something stir. Hope. Naomi Dawson had never been considered delicate. From the time she was a girl, she was taller, broader, and heavier than her peers. What she lacked in beauty, she made up for in kindness. She could sew a wedding dress in 3 nights, cook for a family of 6 on scraps, and sing hymns with a voice so warm that even the hardest heart softened. Yet, in a town like Rockford Crossing, where thinness and daintiness were prized, her body had become her brand of shame. She lived in a small room above the seamstress shop, mending hymns, stitching quilts, and piecing together bridal gowns for other women. She had watched more than one bride walk down the aisle in dresses of her making, knowing full well the whispers, "Naomi can sew fine, but she'll never wear such a gown herself." At the town social that night, she had hoped, just for once, to blend in. She had worn her best calico, her hair pinned carefully, and her brightest smile, but the cruel taunt of a boy and the laughter of grown men and women had stripped her of dignity. The pain stung sharper, because she had heard it all before, only never so publicly. And then Sam Holt had walked in. Sam was a man forged by wilderness and grief. 6 months earlier, fever had taken his wife Mary and left him to raise their daughter alone in a cabin high in the timberline. Since then, he had become more ghost than man, appearing only when necessary, speaking little, his face shadowed with loss. Yet that night, when Annie called Naomi Mama, something inside him broke open. The townsfolk didn't know what to make of it. Some whispered it was madness, others scoffed, insisting Sam was blinded by loneliness. But Naomi saw none of that in his eyes. What she saw was resolve. After the social ended, Sam walked her to the preacher's home, Annie still clinging to her skirts. He explained in plain words, "She hasn't smiled since Mary passed. Tonight, she clung to you as if she'd been waiting all her life. I won't tear that away from her. If you'll have it, Naomi, we'll marry tonight." Naomi's breath caught. Marriage? To Sam Holt? the silent mountain man feared and respected in equal measure? Her heart warred with her mind. She thought of the laughter, the humiliation. She thought of Annie's small arms around her waist. And for the first time in years, she thought of what it might feel like to be wanted, not for her skills, not for her service, but for who she was. The preacher, roused from his bed, blinked at the sight of them on his doorstep. "This is sudden," he murmured, but Sam only replied, "God brought her to us tonight. That's reason enough." And so it was done. By lantern light, with Annie holding Naomi's hand, vows were spoken, not for romance, not for passion, but for something sturdier, need, respect, and the faintest spark of hope. Yet, as Naomi stepped out into the cold night air, now a wife, she knew the hardest journey was only beginning. The townsfolk would not forget their laughter easily, and the mountains, she suspected, would test her even more than their scorn. The morning after their hurried wedding, Naomi stood at the edge of Rockford Crossing with only a small trunk of belongings. Her heart was a battlefield of fear and trembling hope. Behind her lay the jeers of the townsfolk. Before her stretched the mountains, vast and unyielding. Sam arrived with a mule-drawn wagon. Annie perched beside him, wrapped in a shawl too big for her small frame. Without a word, he helped Naomi into the wagon. The road to Thunder Ridge was rough. The wheels jostled over frozen ruts, and icy winds whipped Naomi's cheeks until they burned. Sam spoke little, his eyes always scanning the trail, yet his silence wasn't hostile. It was steady, like the mountains themselves. From time to time, he handed Naomi a blanket or slowed the team so she could rest her back. Each quiet gesture spoke more than words could. Annie, nestled between them, reached for Naomi's hand often. The child's trust disarmed her. For years, Naomi had longed for companionship, but had never imagined it might come first from a child. Each time Annie smiled or leaned against her, Naomi felt something long buried stir, an ache for family, for belonging. By noon, they reached the river crossing. Ice clung to the rocks, and the water foamed white with winter's force. Sam climbed down, testing the current. "It'll be rough," he said at last. "Hold Annie tight." He led the wagon across. Boots braced against the current, shoulders straining with the reins. For a moment, Naomi feared they'd be swept away. But when they reached the far bank safely, Annie squealed in delight, and Naomi caught Sam's rare smile, faint but real. The trail grew steeper as they ascended into the pines. Shadows lengthened, and the air turned thin and sharp. Naomi's body ached, but she refused to complain. She had heard the townsfolk whisper that she was too soft, too heavy for mountain life. Every step became a vow to prove them wrong. As dusk fell, Sam pulled the wagon into a small clearing. "We'll camp here," he said. He showed Naomi how to gather dry pine needles for kindling, how to angle branches so the wind wouldn't snuff the flames. When her hands fumbled, he didn't scold. He simply guided hers with his own until the fire caught. The warmth spilled against their faces, chasing back the cold. Naomi cooked a simple supper from salt pork and beans. The smell carried through the trees, and for the first time that long day, Annie laughed, a bright, clear sound. Naomi glanced at Sam across the fire. He was watching his daughter, but when his eyes flicked toward Naomi, there was no disdain there, no mockery, only a quiet recognition, as though he saw in her what others refused to. That night, Sam unrolled his bedroll a little apart from hers. "You and Annie take the blankets," he said gruffly. "I'll keep the fire going." Naomi didn't argue. She tucked Annie close, listening to the child's steady breathing while the firelight played on Sam's broad shoulders. In that moment, she realized this marriage might not have begun with love, but it carried the weight of something just as enduring: duty, kindness, and the fragile beginnings of trust. The next morning, Frost clung to Naomi's bonnet, and her breath rose in clouds. Yet, as she climbed back into the wagon, she found her fear was lessening. The wilderness was harsh, yes, but in its wild silence, she felt freer than she ever had in town. No one here mocked her. No one whispered. Here, she might finally become something more than the fat seamstress everyone pitied. By the time the cabin came into view, timbers dark against the snow, smoke curling faintly from the chimney, Naomi's heart was pounding not with dread, but with anticipation. This cabin, rough and weathered though it was, would be the place where her true story began. The cabin was smaller than Naomi expected. Built of rough-hewn logs, it sat at the edge of the forest, overlooking a wide meadow now blanketed with snow. The roof sagged into places, and one shutter banged loose in the wind. Yet smoke curled from the chimney, and Annie ran ahead, squealing with joy to be home. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine resin. The main room was simple: a stone hearth, a scarred wooden table, and two narrow beds pushed against opposite walls. A shelf lined with tin cups and chipped plates sagged under the weight of years. Naomi stood quietly, taking it all in. This was no fine house in town, but there was something honest about it, something that stirred her pride. Sam cleared his throat. "It isn't much," he said, almost apologetically, "but it's kept us warm enough." Naomi set her trunk near the hearth and rolled up her sleeves. "Then we'll make it more than enough," she replied. That first evening, she swept the floor, patched the torn curtain over the window, and cooked a stew thick enough to make Annie lick her spoon clean. Sam ate silently, but nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than praise from any other man. Days slipped into weeks. Naomi rose early, coaxing the fire back to life before Sam returned from chopping wood. She mended his worn shirts with neat stitches and taught Annie to sew simple hymns, turning the task into a game. When the roof leaked during a snowstorm, Naomi climbed onto a stool, hammer in hand. Sam started to protest, but she silenced him with a firm glance. "I can swing a hammer as well as a needle," she said, and he let her. There were tender moments, too, small things that stitched their lives together. Sam always waited until Naomi and Annie had eaten before serving himself. Annie, once so solemn, began to chatter endlessly, sharing every thought and dream with Naomi as though she'd been her mother forever. And Naomi, who had once hidden her laughter for fear of mockery, found herself laughing freely by the fire, her cheeks glowing with warmth instead of shame. One afternoon, Sam returned from hunting with a haunch of venison. Naomi prepared it with wild herbs she had gathered with Annie, filling the cabin with a rich, savory aroma. As they ate, Annie exclaimed, "It tastes like a feast, Mama!" Naomi froze, the word ringing through the small room. She glanced at Sam, uncertain, but his eyes softened, and he said quietly, "A feast it is." Still, not everything was easy. There were nights when Sam sat long by the fire, staring into the flames with a grief he would not voice. Naomi sensed the shadow of his late wife lingering in every corner, from the quilt folded at the foot of his bed to the pressed flowers in a jar on the shelf. She did not try to replace her. Instead, she honored the silence, tending the fire until it glowed steady, a companion to his brooding. And there were moments Naomi faltered, Harsh words from townsfolk echoed in her mind when she caught sight of her reflection in the frost-darkened window. But each time doubt rose, Annie's small arms around her waist, or Sam's simple act of placing an extra log on the fire before she woke, reminded her that she was not alone. One morning, after a heavy snow, Naomi bundled herself in layers and followed Sam outside. "Teach me," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Teach you what?" "To split wood." He chuckled, a rare sound, deep and surprised. "You'll blister your hands." "Then let them blister." And so he placed the axe in her grip, guiding her stance. She brought it down, awkward at first, then with growing strength, the crack of splitting pine echoing through the cold air. When she finally managed to split a log clean in two, Sam clapped her shoulder, his touch lingering just a breath longer than before. As winter deepened, the cabin became more than shelter. It became a sanctuary, alive with laughter, shared work, and the quiet companionship of two people slowly learning to trust. Naomi no longer felt like the outcast mocked at the town social. She was a wife, a mother, a woman proving herself with every stitch, every meal, every swing of the axe. And though no words of love had yet been spoken, something unspoken flickered between her and Sam, something steady and warm, like the fire that never went out in the hearth. The snow was beginning to thaw when the first sign of trouble arrived. Sam and Naomi had just finished mending the corral fence when the Blackwood brothers rode up. Lean and sharp-eyed, they had long nursed a grudge against Sam for refusing to sell them timber rights in the valley. Their horses stamped the ground, nostrils steaming in the cold, while the brothers looked down at Naomi with sneers. "Didn't know mountain men took in strays," one jeered. "She'll eat you out of house and home before summer comes." Sam's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Naomi straightened. Her voice was calm, clear. "This house may be small, but there's room enough for dignity. You should try bringing some with you next time." The brothers scowled, muttering under their breath as they rode off, but Naomi noticed the shadow in Sam's eyes. He knew their kind. They wouldn't let things rest. A few weeks later, the railroad surveyors appeared. Tall stakes were driven into the meadow below the cabin, each one a silent threat. Their foreman, a slick man named Randall Pierce, carried a bundle of documents and a smug smile. "Government's given us claim to this valley," he announced. "By next year, there'll be tracks running straight through it. Best pack up before you get steamrolled, literally." Sam demanded to see the papers. Pierce waved them in his face, but wouldn't let him hold them. "All signed and sealed," he said. "Not that it matters. Folks like you can't fight the railroad." Naomi felt her stomach knot. She had heard whispers in town that deeds were being forged, that settlers were tricked into giving up water rights with fine print they couldn't read. But she said nothing, not yet. That night, after Annie was asleep, Naomi found Sam sitting at the table, staring at his wife's old Bible. His shoulders were heavy with weariness. "They'll come for this land," he muttered. "They always do." Naomi sat beside him. "Then we fight, not with guns, with truth." Sam looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You sound certain." "I know what it is to be stolen from," she whispered. "When I was a girl, the orphanage took in children with nothing. I learned to read contracts for the matrons, to keep swindlers at bay. I can read theirs, too. If those papers are false, we'll prove it." Sam's gaze softened, a new respect dawning. Yet even as she spoke, Naomi knew there was more at stake than deeds. She had overheard something weeks earlier at the railroad feast. The foreman and his clerk whispering about backdated documents, about breaking treaties with the Cheyenne. She hadn't told Sam then, afraid to burden him with more than he already carried. Now, keeping it secret felt like a weight pressing against her chest. The tension grew. Town gossip spread. Whispers that Naomi had trapped Sam into marriage, that she was a burden. At church, women turned their backs. Men smirked. Naomi bore it quietly, until one Sunday, when Annie tugged her hand and asked loudly, "Why won't they talk to you, Mama?" Naomi bent low, her heart breaking, and whispered, "Because they don't know you and I are enough." Still, there were flickers of light. Annie thrived under Naomi's care, reading by the fire and sewing tiny dolls from scraps of cloth. And Sam, though still guarded, began to share pieces of his past. One evening, as snow drifted outside, he admitted, "I wasn't always a mountain man. I wore Union blue once, lost men I called brothers, lost my wife after the war. Since then, I've been waiting for something to live for." Naomi met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "Then maybe it's time to stop waiting." The moment was fragile, charged, yet unfinished, because the next morning the Blackwood brothers returned with news. The sheriff had been paid by the railroad. Warrants were being written. If Sam and Naomi resisted, they would not only lose their land, they would be branded criminals. The peace of the cabin cracked, replaced by a storm neither of them could avoid. The knock came just after dusk, heavy and deliberate against the cabin door. Naomi froze with Annie pressed close at her side, while Sam rose from the table, his hand brushing the rifle propped in the corner. When he opened the door, lantern light spilled over Randall Pierce, the railroad foreman, flanked by the Blackwood brothers and two deputies from town. Their shadows stretched long across the snow. "Evening, Holt," Pierce drawled, waving a sheaf of papers. "Got ourselves official warrants. Sheriff says this land's ours. You and your wife." He sneered at Naomi. "Got till dawn to clear out, or we'll clear you out." Naomi's heart pounded, but she stepped forward before Sam could speak. "Those warrants are lies, and everyone in this valley will know it." The Blackwood brothers laughed. "Hear that? Fat lady thinks she's a lawyer." Sam's voice cut sharp through their jeers. "Careful how you speak of my wife." A tense silence followed, broken only by the hiss of snow against the lantern. Naomi saw something shift in Sam, no longer the cautious widower, but a man standing whole, unafraid, because he wasn't standing alone. Pierce smirked. "Fine words, Holt, but words won't stop iron rails. Move or be moved." Sam lifted the rifle, steady as a stone. "No one takes this land tonight." Naomi felt Annie tremble at her side. She knelt and whispered, "Courage, little one. Sometimes the truth needs a voice." Rising, she faced the men squarely. "You claim law, but I carry proof. The treaties, the deeds, you forged them. And I'll swear it in court, before God and man." The deputies hesitated. Doubt flickered in their eyes. Pierce barked at them to act, but no one moved. The spell of his authority was cracking. Suddenly, one of the Blackwoods lunged, knocking the rifle aside. Chaos exploded. Sam grappled with him, the two men crashing into the snow. The other brother swung a fist, but Naomi seized the iron skillet from the hearth and struck, the clang ringing like a church bell. The man stumbled back, stunned. Pierce cursed, but before he could draw his pistol, hoofbeats thundered from the darkness. Lanterns appeared, Mourning Dove and several Cheyenne riders, followed by townsfolk who had quietly trailed the railroad men. Among them was the circuit preacher, Bible in hand. "Enough!" the preacher thundered. "This land will not be stolen under the cover of lies." Surrounded, Pierce's bravado faltered. The deputies stepped back, unwilling to stand against so many witnesses. The Blackwoods spat curses, but mounted their horses and rode off into the night. Sam, breathing hard, lowered the rifle he'd reclaimed. He turned to Naomi, his face fierce and tender all at once. "You spoke the truth when I couldn't. You kept us standing." Naomi swallowed the tears burning her eyes. "No, we stood together." Annie slipped between them, clinging to Naomi's skirts. "Mama kept us safe," she whispered. The word, spoken so clear and proud, was louder than any gunshot. And in that moment, Naomi knew the fight was not just for land, but for the family they had become. Snow still drifted outside when the cabin door was finally barred, the fire crackling bright against the long night. Naomi moved slowly about the room, setting Annie's quilt, righting the table, her hands trembling from the storm they had just weathered. Sam watched her, the hard lines of battle still etched in his face, but softened now by something deeper. He laid the rifle aside and crossed the floor. "You're safe here," he said quietly. The words weighted with more than just tonight's danger. His hand brushed hers, rough and calloused, yet gentle as he guided her to sit by the fire. "This is your home now, if you'll have it." Naomi's breath caught. She looked at him, at Annie curled against her lap, at the battered cabin that still stood. For so long she had been the object of laughter, pity, or silence. Yet here, in this moment, she was simply wanted, needed. Her voice cracked, but she forced the words past the knot in her throat. "I will. With all my heart, I will." Annie stirred, half asleep, her small hand clutching Naomi's dress. "Mama," she whispered. Tears slipped down Naomi's cheeks as Sam placed an arm around both of them, drawing them close. Outside, the wind howled and the valley lay cloaked in white. But within the cabin there was warmth, of fire, of family, of hope. Still, Naomi knew the fight was not finished. The railroad would not surrender easily, and prejudice did not vanish overnight. But for the first time, she faced the unknown not as a mocked outcast, but as wife, as mother, as the heart of a home. Could their love withstand what lay ahead? Only time would tell. Stories like Naomi's remind us that love is not found in appearances or wealth, but in courage, dignity, and the strength to stand together when the world says you don't belong. Every time you share your thoughts, I'm reminded how stories can bind strangers into a family across oceans and miles. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know. And if you still believe that love can rise from mockery and turn shame into honor, stay close. The next story was written just for you.